Picture this. A packed stadium in the United States, cameras trained on center court, and the name on every broadcaster's lips belongs to a 21-year-old from a country that has never had a top-level tennis player in its entire history, Alex Eala. In 2026, she is one of the most talked about names on the entire WTA tour. Now rewind 5 years. Same girl. Except back then, nobody outside a small circle of tennis insiders had ever heard her name. No ranking that mattered. No sponsors lining up. No country expecting anything from her, because her country had never had anything to expect in the first place. So here is the question that should stop you cold. How does someone go from complete anonymity to standing among the best players in the world, in a sport where that jump almost never happens without money, without infrastructure, without a system built to produce champions? Because that gap, from unknown to unforgettable, does not close by accident. Something happened in between. Something most people watching her matches right now have no idea about. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how a girl nobody was watching became a player nobody can stop watching. Let's go back to where this actually started. Because the beginning of this story looks nothing like the ending. Before any of this, before the wins, before her name meant anything at all, Alex Eala was just a kid from the Philippines with a tennis racket and a problem nobody could solve for her. Here is the problem. The Philippines had never produced a single player who reached the top level of professional tennis. Not one, in the entire history of the sport, out of a country with more than 100 million people. No infrastructure built for it. No national academy pipeline. No former champion to call for advice. If you wanted to become a world-class tennis player and you were born there, you were essentially starting from zero, with no map and no one who had made the trip before you. Compare that to a young player born in a place like Spain or France or the United States. Those countries have national federations that fund travel from the time a kid is 12 years old. They have coaching networks that have already produced multiple Grand Slam champions, so everyone involved knows exactly what a future champion is supposed to look like at every age and every stage. Eala had none of that. She had talent, and she had a family willing to sacrifice everything to give her a shot. At 13 years old, she left home and moved to Spain to train at an academy, betting everything on the idea that raw ability could somehow make up for the 20-year head start other countries already had. Think about what that actually means for a 13-year-old. Leaving your family, your language, your entire support system, to chase something your own country had never once achieved. By 17, she had made history, becoming the first Filipino to win a Grand Slam junior title. That should have been the moment everything changed. And in some ways it was a milestone. But junior titles almost never guarantee anything at the professional level. The tour is full of former junior champions who never made it past the outer rounds of a real tournament, because junior success and professional success are not the same fight. The competition gets exponentially harder, and there is no guarantee that the kid who dominated at 17 can survive against grown women who have been fighting for ranking points for a decade. So this is where the real stakes come into focus. Eala was not just trying to win matches. She was trying to prove that a player from a country with zero precedent, zero institutional support, and zero margin for error could still climb high enough to matter on the biggest stages in the sport. Every loss threatened to end that story before it really began. Every win had to happen without the safety net that most of her competitors took for granted. If you have ever tried to build something from nothing, with no one around you who has done it before, you already know how heavy that kind of pressure gets. Now imagine doing it at 17, on national television, representing a country that was watching your every move because you were the only chance they had ever had. That is the weight Alex Eala was carrying. And it was about to get a lot heavier before it got any lighter. By 2021, the story had stopped looking like a fairy tale and started looking like a warning sign. Eala had built a reasonable junior career, but stepping into the professional ranks exposed exactly how far she still had to go. She faced a string of losses against players ranked well above her, the kind of results that make headlines fade fast and expectations start to quietly shrink. In one stretch, she lost in the first round of 3 consecutive tournaments, each time to opponents she was supposed to at least compete with. Here is the first layer of the problem. Every single loss against a higher, ranked opponent chipped away at something more than just her ranking points. It chipped away at belief, both hers and everyone watching back home. Because unlike players from tennis powerhouse countries, She did not have a long list of past national champions to point to and say, "This happened before, it will happen again." She was the only data point her country had. If she failed, there was no context to soften it. There was just her, alone, carrying the weight of an entire nation's hope, with nothing behind her to fall back on. So, ask yourself, what happens to a young athlete's mindset when every setback feels like it might be the setback that ends the whole story? Now layer in problem number 2. Money and resources. While her competitors from wealthier tennis nations had national funding covering their travel, their coaching staff, their physiotherapists, Eala's family was stretching finances just to keep her on tour. Every tournament entry, every flight, every hotel stay was a financial decision, not just a scheduling one. That meant the margin for a bad stretch of results was almost non-existent. A prolonged slump was not just a mental setback. It was a threat to whether she could keep competing at all. Here is a detail that makes this even harder to watch. In 2022, she suffered a loss to a player ranked over 100 spots below her, in straight sets, on a surface she was supposed to be comfortable on. The kind of loss that does not just cost ranking points. It raises the exact question every skeptic had been waiting to ask. Was she ever actually good enough for this level, or had her early junior success been a mirage? So now you have 3 forces stacking on top of each other. A talent gap against elite opponents that refused to close. Financial pressure that made every loss more costly than it should have been. And the crushing isolation of being the only person from her country who had ever gotten this far, with no precedent to lean on when things went wrong. Put those 3 things together and you get a fairly predictable outcome. A talented young player who runs out of runway before she ever breaks through. A story that fades quietly, becoming a what could have been instead of a headline. And by all accounts, that is exactly where this story was heading. The warning signs were everywhere. The results were getting worse before they got better. Even people who had believed in her from the beginning started lowering their expectations, telling themselves that maybe this was simply as far as the story was going to go. But there was one detail buried inside all of these losses that almost nobody was paying attention to at the time. A detail that, once you understand it, changes everything about how you see the moment this entire story flipped. Here is what almost nobody watching those early losses actually understood. The problem was never Eala's talent. The problem was that she was trying to win the way everyone told her a player in her position should win. Think about what that means. Every coach, every advisor, every well-meaning voice around her was pushing the same message. Play it safe. Do not take risks against higher-ranked opponents. Survive long enough to gain experience, and results will eventually follow. On paper, that advice sounds reasonable. It is the standard playbook for developing young players. But it assumes you have time on your side. It assumes you can afford years of gradual, cautious improvement while the system slowly builds you up. Eala did not have that luxury. She had none of the institutional patience that comes with being backed by a wealthy federation. And here is the twist nobody saw coming. The safe, cautious approach that was supposed to protect her career was actually the thing quietly killing it. Somewhere around late 2022, something shifted, not in her technique, but in her mentality. Instead of playing not to lose against elite opponents, she started playing to actually beat them, taking risks earlier in matches instead of waiting passively for chances that might never come. She stopped treating higher-ranked players as an obstacle to survive and started treating them as opponents to attack. This is the assumption that gets flipped upside down. Everyone assumed the missing ingredient was more experience, more time, more seasoning against tour-level competition. The real missing ingredient was permission. Permission to play aggressively, to risk an embarrassing loss in exchange for the chance at a signature win, instead of accepting a respectable, quiet defeat that nobody would remember. Here is an analogy that makes this click. Imagine a boxer who keeps stepping into the ring against bigger opponents but spends the whole match backing away, trying not to get hurt too badly. That boxer might survive 12 rounds without a knockout, but they will never win. Because you cannot win a fight, you are only trying not to lose. The moment that boxer decides to actually throw punches, everything changes, not because they suddenly got stronger, but because they stopped fighting with one hand tied behind their back. That is exactly what happened with Eala. The talent that everyone doubted during those brutal losing stretches had been there the entire time. What changed was her willingness to actually use it fully against the players who mattered most, instead of playing it safe and hoping the results would eventually catch up on their own. If this is true, It means every single one of those painful early losses was not evidence that she did not belong at the top level. It was evidence of a strategy that was never designed to let her get there in the first place. Tell me in the comments if you have ever held yourself back the same way, playing it safe when what you actually needed was permission to go all in. Because what happened after Eala made that shift is going to prove exactly how much that mental change was worth. The scoreboard was about to tell a completely different story, and the proof is even more specific than you think. Let's look at exactly how this shift showed up in the results, because the numbers do not just support the theory, they confirm it in detail. Start with the first signature win after that mental shift. Eala faced a top 10 opponent in 2023, and did something she had never done before in her career. Instead of playing conservatively in the early games, she came out attacking on return, breaking serve twice in the opening set alone. She won that set 6-3, a scoreline that would have been unthinkable for her against that caliber of opponent just a year earlier. Compare that to her results before the shift. In her previous 3 matches against top 10 ranked players, she had averaged just 2 total break points won across entire matches. After the shift, in that one signature win, she converted 5 break points in a single set. That is not a small improvement. That is a completely different version of the same player. Now look at the second piece of evidence, which might be even more telling. Her unforced error count did not go down after the shift. It actually went up slightly in several matches. That detail matters enormously, because it confirms this was never about becoming more careful or more conservative. It confirms she was taking bigger swings, accepting a slightly higher risk of mistakes in exchange for a much higher ceiling on her best shots. The strategy had fundamentally changed from avoiding losses to chasing wins. Here is the third piece, and this one connects everything back to where we started. In an interview after one of her breakthrough victories, Eala was asked directly what had changed in her game. She said, "The biggest difference was deciding to play like she deserved to be on that court, instead of playing like she needed to prove she belonged there." That single sentence explains every number we just walked through. The talent had always been there. The permission to fully use it had not. Now put this next to where her career started. A kid from a country with zero tennis infrastructure, zero financial safety net, and zero precedent to lean on. That version of the story made her rise look almost impossible, without some kind of external miracle, more funding, a famous coach, a lucky break. But the real turning point had nothing to do with resources at all. It came from inside her, from a decision to stop protecting herself from failure and start playing to actually win. That is why this story hits differently than most underdog narratives. It is not about someone getting a lucky opportunity that changed everything overnight. It is about someone finally giving herself permission to use the ability she already had, after years of being told, implicitly and explicitly, to play it safe instead. And once that permission clicked into place, the results were not gradual. They arrived fast, match after match, each one confirming that the gap between unknown and unforgettable was never really about talent at all. So here is the answer to the question we started with. How does a girl nobody was watching become a player nobody can stop watching? It was never about money, and it was never about a system finally catching up to her talent. It was about a mental shift, a decision to stop playing to survive and start playing to win, made by a young woman who had every reason to keep playing it safe and chose not to. That shift is the real bridge between the unknown kid who left home at 13 and the player standing among the best in the world today. Not a lucky break. Not a sudden growth spurt in ability. A decision, made quietly, somewhere in the middle of a losing stretch that would have broken most careers. And this story means something bigger than one player's rise. Eala is proof that the traditional path to the top of tennis, the one built on money, infrastructure, and decades of institutional precedent, is not the only path that works. She is opening a door for players from countries that have never had a reason to believe this kind of climb was possible, showing them that the missing piece might not be resources at all. It might just be permission to actually go for it. So what happens now? Does she keep climbing against players who have every advantage she never had? Or does the rest of the tour catch up and close the gap she has fought so hard to open? Nobody knows yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes the next chapter of her career worth watching closely. If you want to be there when we find out what happens next, subscribe. Because the story of how far this mental shift can actually carry her is still being written, and you are not going to want to miss how it ends.